Chapter 30 is looking at World War I and America's involvement from 1917 to 1918. Now, as we referenced in the last chapter, we are looking at reasons for why the United States eventually got involved in World War I. Remember, we'd started out as an isolationist nation, trying to play both sides of the coin, trying to trade with both the Allies and the Central Powers. That didn't work out, obviously, because the British had been so effective at the blockade against Germany. But the one thing that Germany did have were their U-boats, their submarines. And so when Germany announces that they would launch unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships in the war zone, Wilson started proposing arming merchant ships. The nation is still looking, though, for isolationism. We're not quite at the point where we're ready to go to war or arm our merchant ships, even though they are in danger of being sunk. That is until March of 1917, when the British intercepted and decoded what becomes known as the Zimmermann telegram. This was a secret coded message from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to be sent to the German ambassador stationed in Mexico, proposing that the German ambassador ask the Mexican president for an alliance should the United States enter the war against Germany. Basically, it was asking Mexico, if America enters this war against Germany, you attack the United States. Keep them busy on the home front so that they can't do that much damage to us over here in Europe. And if you do this, we'll ensure that you get back that Mexican cession that you lost at the end of the Mexican-American War. Now, Mexico never accepted this agreement. They never accepted this alliance. But the problem with this is that when it was published in the American newspapers, people were so crazily incensed that Germany would have the gall to do this that people started to change their ideas about isolationism. Add to that, when the Russian Revolution occurred and the Tsar's regime was overthrown by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, they left the Allied powers, they left World War I. So now all the countries on the Allied power side are all democracies, give or take. And all the countries on the Central Power side are all autocratic or dictatorship-style governments. And so even though Americans had long tried to avoid those entangling alliances, as George Washington had warned us back in the day, and even though we were making money as a neutral country, there are overt actions being committed against Americans. U-boats sinking American ships. This Zimmermann telegram advocating for an alliance between Germany and Mexico to hurt the United States. And so on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, saying that the world must be made safe for democracy, that it is our moral obligation to step in. Congress obliged and declared war on April 6, 1917. The U.S. officially joined the Allied powers. Here you see the Zimmermann note in the coded form, and here is the decoded version of the Zimmermann note. And a political cartoon of a German guy whispering to a Mexican, join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. Some promise. Now, Woodrow Wilson, as we've talked about before, was a very high-minded, intellectual type guy. He was a progressive as well, as we've already talked about in the past chapters. So on January 8th, 1918, after the United States had declared war and obviously joined with the Allies, he felt it was his job to be the moral leader of the Allies. So he delivered what becomes known as his 14-point points address, or his 14 points speech, outlining the things he wants to see happen after the war is over. This is basically his post-war plan, and it is heavily based on the ideas of progressivism. But let's take the idea of progressivism and apply it not just to our country, the United States, but to the entire world. Let's create an international organization and a just peace for all. He really was advocating for a, quote, peace without victory, meaning let's not punish let's not punish Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's have a peace without victory so that we can all come back and continue on after this war was over. He also advocated for abolishing secret treaties. He wanted freedom of the seas, to remove economic barriers for all nations, like tariffs, as we've talked about before. Countries who trade with one another very rarely go to war against each other. So if we can create economic cooperation between all the countries of the world, that might go a long way to help make war obsolete, according to Woodrow Wilson. He wanted to make sure that people had the right to self-determination, or to be able to choose their own government, and that governments were fair to native-born people as well, not just to the colonizers. He wanted all the nations of the world to reduce their armaments, meaning reducing the amount of weapons that they had, once again, to avoid an arms race or a buildup of militarism like we've talked about in the past. And also to create an international peacekeeping organization to ensure that war never happens again. So instead of me attacking this other country over there because I'm mad at them for whatever reason, I can take my issue to this international peacekeeping organization and work it out almost in a court. This is the predecessor, or I'm sorry, this is the beginning stages of what becomes the League of Nations. But we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to get all these people across the United States to back this war effort, especially with so many people who are from Germany or from Austria-Hungary? We are a multi-ethnic country at this time. How are we going to get people to start backing the war effort? And more than that, how are we going to get people to buy war bonds in order to pay for this war? So the government created the Committee on Public Information, also known as the Creel Committee, because it was headed up by George Creel. And their sole purpose was to create propaganda to promote the war effort, to get people to sign up and to join the army and to buy war bonds, like I said. This is propaganda at its finest. So at its height, the Creel Committee had 150,000 workers, 75,000 of whom were known as 4-Minutemen. These would be people that would travel from town to town, giving extremely patriotic speeches that would last no more than 4 minutes, because that was judged to be the maximum attention span that an American could listen. They created posters, they created pamphlets, booklets, music, movies, all of it with the same common theme. America is awesome, Germany is terrible. This anti-German rhetoric. So really what this is doing is promoting help for the war effort, to get people to work together, to buy war bonds, to enlist, to mobilize for this war. Here you see some examples of the propaganda created by the Creel Committee. Very effective. But, like I said, there are a lot of people living in the United States that come from the Central Powers. 8 million German Americans living in the United States. And there is a real fear of spying and sabotage here in the United States. German Americans were a big target for a mob mentality type people, being beaten, killed, fired from their jobs, etc. Cultural holdovers were disallowed, meaning German music was banned in a lot of places in the United States. German books, it was illegal in a lot of states to speak German, etc., because there was too much of a link to the enemy. But two of probably the most heinous acts passed by Congress in our entire history occurred during World War I, with the passage of the Espionage and the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it illegal to give information or to interfere with operations of the military. So you can't promote the success of the enemy. And basically the goal here is to shut down any open dissent against the U.S. government. You can't speak badly against the United States. You can't promote Germany's success. If you do, you can have up to a $10,000 fine and up to 20 years in prison. The Sedition Act was almost an add-on to the espionage. And espionage, by the way, means spying. Sedition means almost treason. The Sedition Act of 1819 was an amendment or an add-on to the Espionage Act to combat what they called, quote, subversive activity. It is illegal to use abusive language about the U.S. government or any part of the U.S. government during the war. I couldn't at that time say the U.S. government is wrong to go to war against Germany. That would have been violating the Sedition Act. So As a result of these two acts, 1,900 people were prosecuted under these two acts, including socialist Eugene V. Debs. He was a leading member of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. And if you remember him from the past, he was the leading union member in the Pullman Palace Car union strike back in the 1800s. He has become a radical socialist, and he was sent to prison for 10 years. Eventually, he was pardoned by Warren G. Harding. But the question is, how is this not a violation of the First Amendment? How is it not a violation of my freedom of speech? Well, in a landmark Supreme Court case, Schenck versus the United States of 1919, the Supreme Court said, your right to unlimited freedom of speech is not absolute. You can't say whatever you want. If your speech presents a, quote, clear and present danger to safety of other people, it can be restricted. So the example they gave in the opinion of the court was that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there's not a fire, because that could lead to panic and people getting hurt, and it presents a clear and present danger. So through Schenck versus the United States, they upheld the Espionage and Sedition Acts because your speech during wartime could present a clear and present danger. Now, in order to mobilize for World War I, we obviously need to get the factories up and running. We need to start producing guns and ammunition and all the things that you need to fight a war. And so it was determined that, quote, labor will win the war. We need to have a united labor front in order to get all the stuff we need to fight this war. And so the National War Labor Board was formed with Taft as the chairman to help arbitrate any future problems between labor unions and owners of companies. We can't afford to have a strike during this war because labor is too important to get all of this stuff produced. And so should a union want to go on strike, instead they can appeal to the National War Labor Board and have a third-party arbiter listen to the issue and help them come to a resolution to keep men and women in the factories working. Samuel Gompers and the AFL also issued a no-strike pledge in order to ensure that there was enough labor during the war. Now keep in mind, these are skilled laborers, so they're not going to have a hard time finding jobs anyways during this time, especially since the U.S. government needed so much stuff. And as a result of the concessions given to labor unions during this time, we do see an increase in labor union membership by the end of the war, twice as many by the end of the war as compared to the beginning of the war. And they did receive about a 20% pay increase, but considering inflation or the price of goods had gone up so much, it's pretty much a wash because people were facing higher priced goods as well. The one major exception to all of this is the very radical union group, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, as I just mentioned before with Eugene V. Debs, the Industrial Workers of the World. These are a radical socialist, almost anarchist group of union members. Oftentimes, they are the ones working the lowest of the low jobs. And so the Wobblies by no means are issuing a no-strike pledge like the AFL had done. If anything, they are looking to get more concessions during this time to help raise the standard of living for their workers. But even with all of these efforts to try to end any sort of labor disputes or labor strikes going on, there are still strikes going on during the war. About 6,000 strikes occurred during the war, including the Great Steel Strike of 1919. This was organized by the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers, basically steel workers, and about 250,000 workers across the United States went on strike. What they really wanted was the right to unionize. They wanted their companies to recognize them as a legitimate union. The problem is the companies are looking for an excuse to break through the power of the union because they don't want to have to recognize a union because that's just going to mean trouble for them later on down the road as the owners. And so instead the unions brought in both black and Mexican scab labor in order to try to break this strike. So this is almost a twofold strike. On the one side, there is this economic component, the denial of the right to work because they are on strike. But at the same time, the the owners of these companies are playing on the racism so prevalent in the workers' minds at this time, bringing in black and Mexicans to work as scab labor or as replacement workers during this time. This is going to lead to a lot of violence as a result. We see violence also erupting in terms of the African American mentality in East St. Louis and also in Chicago, both in 1917 and 1919. During this time, as more and more jobs are available for people in the northern cities, African Americans were leaving the South and moving north like never before, really since the end of the Civil War, to look for jobs in these cities. This is known as the Great Migration, if you don't already know that. But with this, with the thousands upon thousands of African Americans moving to the north, this brings a lot of racial animosity to northern cities that they've not had to experience before because there just haven't been as many African Americans. And so we see race riots erupting in the northern cities as a result of the proximity between whites and African Americans in northern cities. Now let's take a look at suffrage. Finally, women are going to achieve the right to vote. There are really two groups participating in the women's rights movement now. We've been talking about this since Seneca Falls in 1848, women trying to achieve the right to vote. Two major parties or two major groups working at this time. The National Woman's Party, this is probably the more radical of the two groups. This was led by Alice Paul. She was a progressive feminist, she was a pacifist, and she said the way to achieve the right for women to vote is on a national level. She wanted to see a national amendment to the U.S. Constitution drafted. But like I said, she's much more radical compared to the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She sent silent sentinels, as they were called, silent protesters to protest outside of the White House. She went on hunger strikes, refusing to eat until women were given the right to vote. She called President Wilson Kaiser Wilson because how ridiculous was it in her eyes that he was advocating for self-determination for people elsewhere in the world, but women, or half of the population, were denied the right to vote here at home. So she said that the way to achieve suffrage is on a federal level instead of a state. Now contrast that to the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This is the more moderate of the two groups. While their goal is the same, to achieve women's suffrage, the way about going about it is different. The National American Women's Suffrage Association is focusing on achieving the right to vote on a statewide level. And they also said the only way for women to get the right to vote is to support the war effort. That you're not going to win any support by being against the war effort like Alice Paul was at this time. And so in the end, after much negotiation and argument and protesting, Woodrow Wilson did reluctantly endorse a suffrage amendment. But obviously this is going to meet resistance not only in the states or in the Senate, but also in the states as well, because it's all men who have to vote on whether or not to grant women the right to vote. But by August of 1920, the states did ratify the 19th Amendment, and with this, for the first time across the United States, all women over the age of 21 were now legally allowed to vote in the United States.